glory to Jesus Christ, and welcome to this week's episode of God with Us Live. Every week, we're joined by men and women, monastics, clergy, and laity, exploring exciting and inspiring ways to live our Eastern Catholic faith today. Your host is Father Deacon Nick Mierzejewski, a husband, father, and deacon of the Ukrainian Catholic Eparchy of St. Nicholas. And now, here's Father Deacon Nick.
Well, hello again, God with Us Live listeners. Father Deacon Nick Mierzejewski, excited as always to be here with you to learn more about our beautiful Eastern Catholic churches. Today, very excited, our guest today, Father Deacon Jeff Mierzejewski. Father Deacon Jeff, whose name will be familiar to you from the Metropolitan Cantor Institute and a lot of other Ruthenian, Byzantine Catholic things going on here in the United States. So welcome, Father Deacon. Would you introduce yourself to our listeners? Tell us a little bit about who you are.
Sure, glad to be here, Father Deacon. My name is Jeff Mierzejewski. I have been a cantor in the Ruthenian Church for about 25 years before becoming a deacon 7 years ago by the grace of God. I'm currently living in Rochester, New York, and regularly down in the Pittsburgh area working at the seminary. I teach in-person and online classes for cantors. I'm a member of our Inter-Eparchial Liturgical Commission as well for the Metropolitan Church of Pittsburgh. I'm a part-time researcher in liturgy and musicology, and married with a wonderful wife, several grown children, and looking forward to our conversation.
Awesome. So you're very involved, obviously, as a cantor of 25 years, involved in the Metropolitan Cantor Institute, cantor, right? So just curious, where did that all start? Where did that passion for music come from? Did it start in a secular direction first with music, or has it always been tied to the church, or how has that been?
Not really. In college, I grew up in Catholic chaplaincies. My parents are academics. And in college, I was a mathematics music major. I was actually studying Gregorian chant in college and had a tutor who was a professor in statistics in the statistics and computer science department, who was from Charles University in Prague, who had actually studied church music in secret under communism with a group of other scholars. And when he came to the United States with his family, who also sing, they did presentations at conferences on comparing chant between East and West, showing how melodies move back and forth and so on. So he taught me, in addition to some Gregorian chant, also some Ukrainian Somilka, but mostly Prostopenia. And I got involved in a Ruthenian church in the area. My wife is Orthodox, so that made a good fit for us. And studied, learned the liturgy, but then in the mid-90s, there was a move afoot to restore the setting, the celebration of Vespers and Matins in our churches, coming from Rome, from Pope John Paul II, to some extent for the bishops. This is in the early days of the internet, and a number of us cantors across the country were going to our pastor saying, could we have Vespers? And almost always the response was twofold. On the one hand, no one will come. And on the other hand, the cantor doesn't know how to do it, or only knows how to do it in Slavonic. So a half dozen of us cantors across the country, several of whom are now monastics, essentially reverse engineered Orthodox books and things in Slavonic and Greek, and tried to figure out all the things that weren't written down about how you do the services. And to the point where we could, talk to old cantors, talking to priests, to the point where by the late 90s, we were able to actually lead, services in our parishes that had fallen out of use for some time. And right around that time, Metropolitan Judson of blessed memory started a large-scale cantor program in Pittsburgh, and got involved with that and stayed involved since. Some years later, I was asked to take over the website. And then around 2013, I became the director of the Cantor Institute.
And how did the diaconate figure in there? I know it came after a while of cantoring, and of course, that's a natural transition, as we see from the minor orders, as someone who just went from a reader, ordained reader, to the subdiaconate and diaconate. I'm familiar with that. But could you talk a little bit more about how those kind of maybe all that involvement with cantoring maybe prepared you for the diaconate, and what was kind of that pull, that calling to the diaconate there?
Could be. I mean, I had felt a call to the diaconate even in my early days when I was predominantly in Roman Catholic parishes because of university chaplaincies, not being around Ruthenian parishes all the time. And actually, at one point that I figured when I was committed permanently to the Ruthenian Byzantine Church, then, at that time, there really wasn't a diaconate program, and I thought that I was giving that up. We did move around for a number of years. We lived off the grid up in New York State with a farm, and between different eparchies really didn't have a chance to apply to a program formally till 2010. One thing I did discover, compared to a number of the other students in my class in the the diaconal formation program, was that I knew very little about what went on in the sanctuary and the altar. I knew a lot about what went on with the singing, but I'd never been an altar server. I'd never, assisted on the other side of the iconostas.
Right.
So, where other diaconal students sometimes had to learn the singing, I had to learn the other stuff. And so that was interesting and fun.
Well, very interesting, very interesting. Yeah, I have to say I had to balance that out, not getting too focused on the cantoring, but also not abandoning the cantoring altogether, because music is obviously a big part of the deacon's role as well. So obviously a big thing, there's a word we mentioned earlier, and for people who might not be familiar with the Ruthenian churches or with the Byzantine Catholic Church here in the United States, might not be familiar with the term, but prostopinja, which is a fancy Slavic word. Could you explain to our listeners who might not be familiar what that is, what that means?
Sure. Prostopinja is the proper name for the particular chant used in our church. Like, Gregorian chant or Anglican chant or any number of other varieties. It arose in really two different parts. There is, of course, a kind of a root Slavic chant that goes back practically to the Christianization of the Slavic peoples when they accepted the Greek liturgy, gradually translating from the Greek language into the vernacular and trying to do it in a way that preserved the music. And you discovered that was really, really hard to translate poetry into poetry while keeping an exact translation. And so
Right.
the Slavs gradually, adapted the melodies, made them more flexible for, longer and shorter phrases, and then developed something called znameni chant, named after the signs or znamenia that were used to write it down, kind of neumes. In our particular church, which came from the Austro-Hungarian Empire across the mountains from the Ukrainians, we had a custom for a couple of hundred years of congregational singing of the entire services. Our churches were generally poor, certainly couldn't afford choirs, and at the same time, the people really exerted an ownership over the liturgy, Vespers and Matins, and the Eucharist celebrated in their churches. And, the chant accommodated that. The chant could be harmonized by ear. It could be sung by the people. There were certain melodies, for feast days and such that were much more complicated. And those were, sung by the cantor out of books of chant. But this simple singing or plain singing prostopinja was really, if you will, almost country chant for the Byzantine Rite in the Slavic languages. And, it wasn't really written down in modern notation until the turn of the last century, around 1906. And even today, it's largely an oral tradition. The music is written down, but if someone who's never been to our churches simply tries to sing it off the page, it never comes out quite right. You really need to experience it and learn how the written music is interpreted. And that's a large part of what we do with cantor education, for people coming to our church that have never experienced it, trying to get them to look at the page a little differently, maybe even put the book down and learn to sing.
That makes a lot of sense, and that's very much a part of it. And I was actually going to ask a little bit about that because just a few minutes ago you're speaking about the effort to kind of restart Vespers and Matins at the
Is it?
parishes, and how that required a lot of speaking to older cantors and gathering a lot of that information. Could you talk a little bit about what that process was like? Because I assume there was probably some variation from parish to parish, especially people who came from different villages back in Zakarpattia, what specific melodies and things like that they were using. So could you talk a little bit about what that process was like, kind of condensing and collating all that information and kind of coming up with this is, these are the melodies we should be using. These are, those sorts of things.
Now, I'll say it wasn't so much the music, to be honest, as the ordo, the services themselves. Which services, which varieties of Vespers are served when, what
Mm.
changes you make if you do or don't have a priest leading the service, and then picking out the hymnody used. In the Byzantine Rite services, there's a huge body of poetic hymns, some of them very richly theological, that weave constantly in the course of the year between the fixed hymns of the services for the day of the year, the services for the Paschal cycle, if you will. I mean, the proper of time.
Right.
And to some extent, the problem that we had was that the services vary so much with the day and the feast and the season that learning what's called the typicon for the Byzantine
Mhm.
services, the rule or order of what you sing and what you say and what you read when, was a problem because in English it had never really been written up properly. And even in
Ah,
Slavonic and Greek, the Typica were originally written for monastics, for monks. They assumed that you were already attending all the services, so you really just needed to be reminded of the details. And there were a huge amount of internal dialogue and discussion about what we're going to sing. There are far more hymns than you can ever sing at any one service.
all right.
And so the net result was something that looked a whole lot like Talmud in the sense of, it's if Palm, on the Palm Sunday is a bad example, but for example, if Cheese Fair Sunday, the Sunday before the first Sunday of Lent, is also a feast with a saint of moderate importance, okay? And you're in the post-festive period of the feast of the entrance of our Lord into the temple, then
Mm.
which order of which hymns do you combine using which tones,
Mm.
to get it right? And this is something that, with 5 or 10, 15 years practice, you can become good at. And in fact, now we have annually a typicon by Father David Petrus that, details which hymns are used when. But even
Right.
there, it's heavily abbreviated. You need to know a lot of background information to make it look easy. And then on top of that, when her music was first used in English, the melodies were often very simplified. In some cases, a lot of melodies were thrown out and say one melody would have been used for everything, which is fine if you're introducing something new and trying to get
Right.
the people to sing. But, after a while, people started finding the old memories and reusing them, but they'd often do them in 4 or 5 different ways. Different parishes, cantors would come up with a different way to restore the old melody. So to some extent, cutting through the underbrush there and going back to the Slavonic books and looking at the different English settings and also what people were already used to and trying to come up with, a coherent body of chant that worked in the services for the people singing. It took an effort. It took some years.
I can imagine. And then, were you involved at all, or maybe you could give a little insight, even if you weren't directly involved? What all was involved in trying to translate some of the texts into English, and especially keeping the rhyme and the meter and things like that, that makes it singable still in English, that it's faithful to the original, but also able to sing in English.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in Greek to this day, if you start singing a series of hymns called Triparia in tone 3, you're using one melody for all of them. It's like the verses of a folk song. Once you know how the first verse is sung, if you see the rest of the words, you can sing them all to the same tune. And that's the way it works in Greek. In Slavonic, it's much more complicated. The phrases get longer or shorter. There are abbreviations you need to learn and so on.
Right.
And as a result, our translations into English, both for Greek and in Slavonic, have never really tried to keep the poetry. The meaning has been far more important. And the translations from the Slavonic to English are a little less close than the Greek to the Slavonic. When they translated the Greek melodies into the Slavonic in the 10th to the 14th centuries, they were almost word for word. You could look at the third hymn, the fourth word, and you would see in Greek and Slavonic it's the same. You can do that in an inflected language. You can do that in English. It doesn't work.
Right.
We were very blessed to have the labors of the Sisters of St. Basil in Uniontown, PA, who translated most of the major hymns of all the great feasts in the course of the year, and a fair amount, though not all of it, of the weekly music in the 8 tones for Vespers and Matins. Vespers more than Matins. Matins became almost extinct in our parishes, except a couple of feast day services like Matins for Easter.
Right.
But Vespers, we had a fairly complete set of books with all the hymns. They weren't set to music. Sometimes they were sung from memory of the melodies by the cantors in the monastery. Sometimes they were just chanted very simply on a single note. So we began with those translations. We learned from various sources, Byzantine Catholic and Orthodox, which hymns were missing, which order to put things in. Sometimes the Uniontown books, which assumed that you knew how to do the services, didn't mention that this particular hymn is only sung on Sundays. We just have the hymn there because they didn't include lots and lots of rubrics, and because it wasn't written for, particularly for priestly celebration, they didn't even really have rubrics of what the priest was doing unless it changed the congregational behavior. At some point you might need to know there's a procession going on so that you know to keep singing until it's over.
Right.
But the sisters had done this work. Later, the Melkites did their own translations. Sometimes the Melkites and the Slavs are looking at the same Greek text, and sometimes they're looking at different ones. We, in terms of our liturgical commission, then they went back and looked over the major feasts and some of the other material, and where necessary, tweaked the nuns' translation. Sometimes that was made necessary by, for example, there's a particular word in Greek and in Slavonic that we use as a title for the Mother of God, Theotokos Bogorodice, which is difficult to translate into English. Very often early on, people punted and called it Mother of God, but that's actually a different set of words in Greek and Slavonic. And so, after much discussion, we decided to do what was also done in the Russian Orthodox OCA, the Orthodox Church in America, and simply left that word untranslated. The same way we leave, Amen and Hosanna and Hallelujah untranslated. We said, this is a difficult word, but, we know what it means and it's precious to us. We will just keep it. So, in some cases, we went to the sisters' translations, and look, wherever it said Mother of God, we had to determine what it really said in the Slavonic, and decide which ones should be different. In some cases, bless them, the nuns might translate the same hymn 4 different times where it occurred in different places. And so you'd have to look at the different, you'd have to determine, this hymn looks familiar. Is this one we already have a translation of? And which is the best translation, or which one have the people already memorized? So, all of that sort of work, has been done. We now have Vespers being celebrated regularly in many parishes. We have a surprising number of parishes now celebrating Matins for Sundays and feasts. Maybe as many as 15 or 20 parishes across the country which would have been completely unheard of in the early 2000s when the Cantor Institute started. At that point, when the MCI did a Sunday and Feast Day Matins book around 2004, 2006, this was brand new. It was used in the seminary, but it was, it really wasn't something that people were clamoring for until more recently. As parishes have been celebrating Vespers, now they're saying, we have Rosary or the third hour before the Divine Liturgy on Sunday morning, but, maybe we could do Matins. So one of the things that we've been doing is providing some guidance. If parish says, we could do Matins, but if you do Matins by the book, it can easily take an hour and a half, and you're navigating through 5 or 6 huge books of hymns that you have to combine in a particular order. So, the question is, at what point do you say, what's an achievable version of this service for a particular parish, with the idea that we may add more later?
That makes a lot of sense, and that's really interesting to know, especially all the work that goes into it. I think sometimes people don't really appreciate all of the blood, sweat, and tears that goes into producing these translations, producing these books. They may see the little booklet in the pew, right, but not understand just how much work went into creating that. Especially like you said, going back, comparing 4 different translations of hymns, figuring out which one is the closest, maybe which one's more known, and things like that. So. Really, and it's magnificent stuff. We'll talk a little bit in the second half about all of the resources available through the Metropolitan Cantor Institute and more about that. But it's really impressive, all the work that's been done. So I'm excited to talk about that when we come back from a quick break. So stay tuned here on God With Us Live.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Scenes with the Saints. Do you know which saint sang himself out of prison? Saint Joseph the hymnographer was born around the turn of the 9th century to pious Christian parents Plotinus and Agatha. At the age of 15, Saint Joseph entered a monastery and was later ordained a priest. At the same time, another monk from a nearby monastery, Saint Gregory the Decapolite, was preparing to go to Constantinople to preach against the heresy of iconoclasm. After he met St. Joseph, he knew he had found a perfect partner for his mission. Saints Gregory and Joseph preached in city squares and even in people's homes, explaining and defending the use of holy icons. Despite their valiant efforts, though, both the Patriarch and the Emperor remained iconoclasts, and so the Orthodox monks of Constantinople decided to send St. Joseph to the Pope of Rome, Leo III, to ask for his help. However, the iconoclasts had learned of this plan and had pirates kidnap St. Joseph. They imprisoned him for 6 years until, on the Nativity of our Lord, St. Joseph received a special visitor. St. Nicholas the Wonderworker appeared to St. Joseph and told him the joyous news that the iconoclast emperor had died and the persecutions would be over. St. Nicholas also gave St. Joseph a scroll that read, "Hasten, O gracious one, and come to our aid if possible, and as you will, for you are the merciful one." St. Nicholas ordered Joseph to eat the scroll and then sing the words that it contained. No sooner had St. Joseph done this than his chains fell to the floor, the doors of his cell opened, and he found himself miraculously transported to the outskirts of Constantinople. When he returned to the imperial city, he developed a devotion to the holy apostle Bartholomew and wanted to compose a canon to him, but felt unworthy of such a special task. After days of praying and agonizing over this, St. Bartholomew appeared to him, encouraging him. From that day onward, he was able to compose beautiful verses dedicated to St. Bartholomew, the Theotokos, St. Nicholas, and other saints. Sadly, the iconoclastic heresy returned, and he was exiled and restored 2 more times before reaching an old age. When he felt his death was approaching, he prepared himself, received the holy mysteries, and his soul was carried to heaven by the saints to whom he had composed hymns. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Scenes with the Saints. Join us again next time when we learn more about the lives of these holy men and women.
Well, hello again, God with Us Live listeners. Father Deacon Nick here with you, and we have Father Deacon Jeff from the Metropolitan Cantor Institute on the line with us, talking about a lot of the hard work that's gone into producing a lot of the translations and music currently used by the Byzantine Catholic Church in America, also known as the Ruthenian Catholic Church here in the United States. So one of the things you kind of touched on this a little bit about the sort of the genesis of the Metropolitan Cantor Institute. But one of the big features I think a lot of people are familiar with are is the website. A lot of the online features there. It's quite an extensive website. Could you talk a little bit about how kind of it went from trying to restore these services, right, to building out this beautiful website full of all sorts of resources, sheet music and recorded music and all kinds of things like that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. In the beginning, the website was primarily for the purpose of making available the PDFs with the leaflets for Vespers on Saturday evenings and the Eves of Feasts, and Divine Liturgy or Eucharist on Sundays and feasts. That was being done at the seminary, and we decided to make it available to cantors through a website. Once we had that, it made sense to start doing some instructional articles whenever we do a class. Sometimes we'd, encapsulate what had been done into a couple of pages. We put a liturgical calendar up that shows you, for each Sunday, what the commemoration of the Sunday is, what the tone of the week is, links to the music and this sort of thing. We took recordings that had been made for our new Divine Liturgy service book in 2006, and a set of LP recordings of Slavonic chant and some other things, and put those available as well. And then, as we were doing in-person classes, which we're doing about 5 Saturdays a year in Pittsburgh, we really came to the conclusion that it was perhaps as much as people could travel for, but really wasn't enough. Anyone who's taught knows that if your students are gone for 3 months, they have a hard time, remembering what you did last time.
Right.
So we experimented with some online classes. We tried it. We didn't like it. They didn't work very well. We went back to in-person classes and taught some seminars and cantor boot camps and other things around the country. And then COVID happened. And at that point, we really decided we had to find a way to make the online work. And we did. After some experimentation, we put together a set of online self-paced courses with recordings the students do and teacher feedback for singing that cover pretty much soup to nuts all the job of a cantor, the liturgical information you need, some elementary spiritual formation, the setting up of the services, the singing of the services, and then the leadership skills, trying to teach the things that a cantor needs to do, to actually lead the singing of a congregation. And we put those into what ended up being a 2-year course, 2-year sequence of courses. The initial courses on the liturgy and on church singing and reading in church are free. They're open to anyone. The courses that require feedback, like the Intro to Singing in Church, are free to members of the Byzantine Catholic Church in the United States. We have, I think, a $75 fee for people coming from elsewhere if you want to learn our chant but aren't in our church, simply because, it takes time to grade these and provide feedback and so on. But, for a couple of $100, which we waive, either in cases of financial need or if a parish does not have a current serving cantor. This 2-year program, you can learn enough. Our goal was to teach you enough that we could airdrop you into a parish, and you could lead the services and survive long enough to learn the particular quirks of the parish that you were in. Every parish has its own customs, a few melodies no one else has, ways of doing things, how the pastor leads the services, that sort of thing, that the cantor has to work with. You can't simply come in and declare how things will be done. But so we came up with a program that teaches you to lead the singing at the Divine Liturgy, the Eucharist, of course, but also Vespers and Matins, the services for the Great Fast, Holy Lent, including the Liturgy of the Presanctified Gifts, feast day vespers, molebens, and other kinds of prayer services like the Akathist hymn, Holy Week, Christmas, Easter. All of those things are covered in the courses fairly thoroughly, using the materials that our church, customarily has in the parish. So, all of that is on the website, and in fact, you can log in as a guest to mci.archpit.org. Click on the MCI online in the upper right, and you can create a guest account. Even without signing up for a class, you can look at all the materials that we have. So we've made that available. We're looking in the future at doing some cooperative work with the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in the United States and Canada, which I would love to see happen. They have a different variety of chant and also a different way of using the chant, because they tend to be more oriented toward choirs leading the singing in parishes.
Right.
But, I'm looking for possibilities of collaboration, as well as in our own parishes, giving occasional workshops, whether for church readers. We've given a 3 or 5 day sequence for people who are brand new to our chant, to give them the absolute basics in an intensive course to be, to think about becoming cantors. Being a cantor is really a vocation. It requires a lot of preparation, but having good cantors is absolutely necessary to the way that we worship.
Absolutely, 100%. And I have to say, even though some of the content obviously is oriented towards the Ruthenian Church, the Byzantine Catholic Church in America, there's still a lot of it, especially that intro course that goes through the concept behind a lot of the services and the concept behind the 8 tones and things like that, that would apply across most of the Byzantine flavored Byzantine Rite churches.
Absolutely.
One thing I was wondering about, though, is that online piece, and I know you have a fancy program specifically for singing that's used on the website. I was curious if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, we use a distance education program called Moodle, which a lot of community colleges and universities use, and it simply lets us divide what's to be taught into some units, some segments, and give you some things to read, some things to listen to. We go over the details, of how to read, how to sing from a written page. We teach the bare minimum of music theory that you need. And we found it was actually easy for us to sit down, and instead of what we were originally, the in-person classes, we had music instructors from Duquesne University come and teach what amounts to, here's a junior high school, music course. And some of that was useful and some of it wasn't. And so we actually created our own course that says, how is chant written down on the page? And how can you learn to produce the notes that you need to sing? A lot of our people are what I call third note cantors. If they know the melody, which they usually do, that you're singing, we have about 90 melodies in our church that are routinely used. You hear the first 3 notes, you can start singing. And in fact, in our church, for many years, we sang from pointed texts with no musical notation, just divided up into phrases. And if people knew that this is a particular tone for melody, the cantor would lead it and the people could follow. But what we really need in our church is cantors who are 3-note cantors. Instead of being able to follow at the 3rd note, they need to be able to produce those first, 2, 3, 4 notes to get the music started, so that the people can pick it up and take off. And so, our course is very, very much oriented toward, how to open your mouth and sing what you need to sing.
Now, is that difficult over the internet, especially, as far as pitch and things like that? I don't know. Is it complicated over the internet? Maybe not as much as it used to be, but
well, we do 2 different things. We do use a tool from Australia, actually, called Theta Music Trainer, which in the form essentially of video games lets you practice things like pitch recognition and pitch matching. Can you tell if this is a second or a major third or a minor third by ear? Can you sing back, notes accurately? Those sorts of things we can, instead of drilling in the classroom with everybody else watching if you succeed or fail, you can use with the programs that we have available, in your home, nobody's around, put on a set of headphones and for 10 minutes work on the basics of listening and producing, musical sound. Then, of course, we have recordings of chanted services that you can listen to. We have instructional material explaining, why you're doing things the way you're doing. And then as part of the Moodle package, with a headset or a desk microphone, you record a particular limited thing, like the responses to a particular litany, and submit it. And usually by the end of the day or the next day at the latest, we'll grade it. We'll get it back to you, a response saying, this was good, but you need to pause a little bit more between the phrases in the reading for intelligibility. Or, for example, there's a particular way that we end a reading so that everyone knows it's coming to an end and the servers can go get the incense for the Alleluia and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And you didn't quite do that, and here's how you do it. In fact, I can record my singing in feedback and give it to the student to show them, what I mean by asking them to do things a particular way. We found it works pretty well. Occasionally, we'll do, a Zoom or a Skype call with someone who's having particular problems. We've had 2 or 3 students out of, we've probably had 120 to 150 students taking the actual classes you sign up for.
Uh-huh.
And out of those, we've had 2 or 3 that really had a problem distinguishing pitches, that were routinely running into problems. And at least one of those, I know through a lot of practice with the Theta music trainer, actually resolved those issues. But, this is how you find it. Better now than find it, after you've committed to singing in church and discover you have problems.
Right. Well, very interesting. I always wondered how that piece worked, the online piece and the distant education. But what a great what great tools to be able to offer, especially when our parishes are spread out. In some places like Pittsburgh or Chicago or different places like that, you have a lot of different churches that you can visit to learn. But when you're out here in other cities, when you're the only, we're the only Ukrainian Catholic parish in Minnesota. So if we want to learn, it's got to be online, or you take a trip to Chicago or something like that. But it's great to be able to have these to offer over such a big distance.
Sure. And even our diocese, some of our dioceses are huge. For example, our East Coast Diocese of Passaic, New Jersey, runs from Connecticut to Florida.
Wow.
So, even in one diocese, one eparchy, you have questions. So if we're going to have an in-person meeting of cantors, where do we do it? I think that, there is a real advantage to getting people in the same room to sing for services or for teaching. But the internet has let us do some things that, I think when push came to shove, we really needed to find a way to do.
And I know we've already kind of covered this in a few different ways, but could you kind of talk, probably the question that's on a lot of people's minds, but what do you think the impact has been for the Metropolitan Cantor Institute, for the Byzantine Catholic Church, and for the Eastern churches in general, even?
Well, I can't speak to the Eastern churches in general, though certainly we do have people signing up from various Eastern Catholic and Orthodox churches, for some of the introductory material. And I think we have managed to find a way that in, an 8-week course, we can give you the basics of Byzantine liturgy, no matter where you're coming from. The biggest change that I have seen, I credit not so much to the MCI as such, as to the visionary work of Metropolitan Judson, who really wanted to see the singing in our churches improve and be, on the same page. At one point, our 4 different dioceses were using 4 different books for the Divine Liturgy for the Eucharist, with slight differences. So, now we have, a single way of singing the Divine Liturgy with lots of different musical options. We have established certification standards for cantors. We're not requiring cantors to get the certification, but, we're making it available as a way of saying, this is the material that you really need to be able to know, to do this job. The materials, of course, that we make available, I think, have been instrumental in allowing us to have services like Vespers and Matins as widely as we do. In our church, in our particular church, the Ruthenians in Eastern Europe as well as the United States, we have a very strong tradition up into the 1960s of always celebrating Vespers and Matins, even if a priest wasn't available to celebrate the Mass, the Eucharist. We had parishes that survived having weekly services led by the cantor, for years at a time, through the 30s and 40s, when a priest could only be available occasionally. At this point, fortunately, our parishes are not usually in so dire straits, but we are recovering more of our liturgical patrimony. And that has been, I think, a very good thing for our church, combined at the same time with other changes. For example, having the anaphora, the Eucharistic prayer, said aloud so that the people could hear the prayers. And that has gone hand in hand, with the whole move into the vernacular, which for us started before Vatican II. We were actually using English beginning in the late 1940s, the early 50s. But it took a while for us to have, standard official translations, and that, has been an ongoing process.
It always is. It always is. Well, great. Hopefully our listeners have learned a lot about, what kind of resources are there. And as I mentioned before, even though some of the things that you've done, that the Metropolitan Cantor Institute does, are most relevant, right, to Byzantine Catholics here in the United States, to Ruthenian Catholics. There's also a lot there that's relevant for all of us Eastern Catholics to learn more about the services in general. And we can always appreciate, regardless of which jurisdiction, reclaiming our patrimony, our distinct patrimony. That's always something we can admire in other churches as well. So before we go, any final thoughts? Any final thoughts? And then if you could give the information out for people who'd like to maybe sign up for a class or look at some of the resources.
Sure. My encouragement to everyone listening, no matter where you're coming from, is, live and love the liturgy. Combine your personal prayer with the church's prayer. Experience something new. Even in large cities, you'll often find several different Eastern rites: Coptic, Catholic or Orthodox churches, Ethiopian, Eritrean, all sorts of different varieties. Go and experience it. It's a different part of the church's tradition. You can find our classes and materials at mci.archpitt, archpitt.org. Archpitt.org is actually the Archdiocesan website that has other materials as well. I'm happy to take email at plainchantor, PLAIN chantor @gmail.com. And, look around, see what you can find. And, if you have questions, get in touch with us. If you have a Ruthenian parish, a Byzantine Catholic parish in your area, stop by and listen to the singing, take part.
Well, fantastic. Thank you once again, Father Deacon Jeff, for joining us today. And thank you for tuning in, listening. Again, always wonderful to have you joining us on God With Us Live to learn more about our beautiful Eastern Catholic churches. God bless.
For this week's episode of God With Us Live. Make sure to tell a friend or two about us and subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. Don't forget to follow God With Us online on Facebook and Instagram for even more great content about the Eastern Catholic churches. And don't forget to check out all the other great Eastern Catholic podcasts at godwithusradio.org, where faith meets life. God With Us Live is a production of God With Us Radio, hosted, produced, and edited by Nick Modelski. Send us a message at info@godwithusradio.org.